morning from Mission Control Houston, and welcome to Space Station Live. You're joining us here inside of the International Space Station Flight Control Room, looking down as the Orbit 2 team sits on console, monitoring all of the systems on board this orbiting laboratory. Team being led today by Flight Director Judd Freeling there on the right, and to his immediate right, our Capcom today, Kate Rubens, serving as the communication link between our teams down here on the ground and the astronauts up in space. Those astronauts right now, the crew of Expedition 35, currently a 6-man contingent from nations around the globe. They're being led right now by a Canadian astronaut, Chris Hadfield, there in the front row on the right. Behind him are the crew members who joined him on the station in their Soyuz craft back in December, Russian cosmonaut Roman Romanenko and NASA astronaut Tom Marshburn. On the left, we have our remaining 3 crew members, 2 Russian cosmonauts, Pavel Vinogradov and Alexander Mazurkin, then finally one more NASA astronaut, Chris Cassidy. So throughout the week, the astronauts have been involved in a bevy of biological experiments on board, both cataloging the effects of spaceflight on the human body and a number of others. Starting off with Monday, Commander Chris Hadfield was tasked with operating one of the microscopes inside of the NanoRacks payload, doing an analysis of some of the crystal plates contained in one of the modules to monitor several days of crystal growth. Aside from that, he was doing some air sampling throughout the U.S. segment on board the station, checking for microbiology traces in the astronauts' breathing atmosphere. And while he was doing that, Flight Engineer Number 1, Russian cosmonaut Pavel Vinogradov, was busy transferring some cargo from the recently docked 51 Progress vehicle. That vehicle delivering over 3 tons of supplies to this Expedition 35 crew. You can see it docked all the way at the aft end of the station, way in the back there. Currently one of 4 docked visiting vehicles to the International Space Station. Aside from that, Vinogradov was studying cardiac bioelectric activity while at rest, and he was joined in that by fellow Russian cosmonauts Alexander Mazurkin and Roman Romanenko. Meanwhile, Mazurkin on Monday, aside from that, was doing some saliva and blood collection activities for some ongoing Russian biological studies on board the station. He was also monitoring the Matryoshka experiment, a torso-shaped object on board the station used to study radiation effects, equipped with a number of monitors throughout it to document how much radiation these astronauts are exposed to during their long-duration space flights. Meanwhile, on Monday, Chris Cassidy was working with the Human Research Facility, taking some blood and urine samples of his own, and then storing them in one of the minus 80-degree laboratory freezers on board. He was also working with the BASS experiment. The first day he was working on that throughout the week. He returned to it a number of times. BASS experiment standing for the burning and suppression of solids. It's an investigation looking to examine the burning and extinction characteristics of a wide variety of fuel samples in microgravity. Meanwhile, Roman Romanenko on Monday taking some measurements for the Russian Sprut experiment, which looks to assess the adaptation mechanisms of the human body as it looks to prevent the unfavorable impact of zero gravity on astronauts' hydration status. He was also working with the Russian countermeasures system, checking for any harmful contaminants inside the Russian Zvezda service module. And then finally on Monday, Tom Marshburn, working with the environmental health system, doing some surface sampling of his own, collecting some samples from surfaces throughout the U.S. segment and putting them in small incubators in order to get potent samples for researchers down here on the ground who constantly monitor the astronauts' environment. He was also cleaning out the potable water dispenser, just some routine maintenance on the astronaut's drinking device. Moving on to Tuesday, Commander Hadfield doing some blood sample collections for the vascular study, which looks to determine the impact of long-duration spaceflight on blood vessels for these astronauts. He also entered into a conference alongside of Tom Marshburn and Roman Romanenko with search and rescue specialists and also crew departure prep for his upcoming landing, which will be taking place on May 13th, just under 2 weeks from now. He was also doing some checkouts of the microflow cytometer on board, a technology demonstration which minimalized the size of a standard cytometer for experiments on board the station. Meanwhile, Pavel Vinogradov doing some more saliva and blood collection samples and storing those in freezers. Also downlinking some of the video that was taken when that Progress vehicle docked with the International Space Station again delivering just over 3 tons of food, fuel, and supplies to this Expedition 35 crew. Meanwhile, Alexander Mazurkin doing some lower body negative pressure training that's used to simulate gravitational stress on the astronaut's body in order to help increase their heart rate and blood pressure. He was also replacing a number of smoke detectors throughout the Russian segment, along with Pavel Vinogradov. Meanwhile, Chris Cassidy doing some ultrasound scans. He was scanning his spine along with Tom Marshburn. Also inside of the Columbus laboratory, doing some troubleshooting on a leak that had developed in the water pump assembly number 2. And then Roman Romanenko on Tuesday, working with the electronic nose inside of the Russian station. That's an electronic device on board that is used to measure the crew's exposure to different bacteria and fungi. He was also doing some undocking preparation throughout his day. And then our final crew member on Tuesday, Tom Marshburn, was doing not only that spinal scan, but a number of other scans. The small ultrasound system on board enabling the astronauts to do real-time, high-quality imaging with minimal training. He was scanning his carotid artery and also his bladder and his hand. Moving on to Wednesday, Chris Hadfield did an acoustic survey on board the station using a sound level meter as he looked to help teams down here on the ground understand the sound loads that these crews are exposed to from all the various systems operating on board the station. He also started on the payload Ethernet hub gateway install, something he'll be continuing today, looking to upgrade some of the networking infrastructure that controls all of the payloads on board the station and relays information on them back down to the ground. You can see some of this video right here taken from Wednesday as he was working that. Again, that activity continuing into today. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, Pavel Vinogradov was collecting a few condensate water samples from the Russian gas-liquid mixture filter. He was also cleaning a fan screen on the gas-liquid heat exchanger, just some routine maintenance to keep systems on board the Russian segment working and in tip-top shape. Meanwhile, Alexander Mazurkin was monitoring a number of fluid and coolant loops throughout the Russian segment, taking data points and relaying them back down to controllers in the Russian Mission Control Center in Koryov, Russia. He was also working with the Matryoshka experiment again. He was joined in that by Roman Romanenko. But meanwhile, Chris Cassidy on board on Wednesday was kicking off one of the many science experiments on board the station, the capillary flow experiment, also known as CFE. It's a suite of fluid physics experiments that looks to investigate how fluids move up surfaces in microgravity. Results from that research hope to improve current models that are used by designers down here on the ground of low gravity fluid systems and also fuel systems. It could hopefully improve fluid transfer for not only fuel but also water and other devices on future spacecraft. Cassidy was also setting up the SLAM device, the Space Linear Acceleration Mass Measurement device, that is used on board the station in order to measure the mass of these astronauts using the basic equation, force equal to mass times acceleration. That applies a known force to the astronauts, measures the acceleration, and then is then able to deduce the astronauts' mass. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, Roman Romanenko packing up a number of items for that Soyuz TMA-07M spacecraft that he'll be returning in. Romanenko will be the commander of that craft when they return home. He'll be returning along with Chris Hadfield and Tom Marshburn. Once they return, they'll be bringing an end to their time on board the station, which started back on Friday, December 21st. They'll have spent 144 days on board the ISS, 146 total days in space. And meanwhile, on Wednesday, Tom Marshburn was replacing a number of belts on 2 of the centrifuges inside of the European Modular Cultivation System. It's a payload found inside of the Columbus laboratory on board the station, used in a number of plant growth and also small microorganism and even small invertebrate studies, studying the early stages of life and growth for many of these as they're exposed to microgravity. Moving on to Thursday, Chris Hadfield setting up a camera and mixing up a sample for the binary colloidal alloy test, studying small particle growth inside of microgravity. He was also working to replace a laptop on the Space Acceleration Measurement System, which studies small forces such as vibrations and accelerations of the International Space Station that are a result from the operation of all the hardware on board, but also crew activities and dynamic activities such as dockings and maneuverings. Meanwhile, Pavel Vinogradov sampling some of the condensate water upstream from that gas-liquid mixture filter that he was working on earlier in the week and transferring some items over from that 51P cargo vehicle. You can see the total station makeup to Progress currently docked to the International Space Station 50 and 51, 50 being the most recent, again delivering about 3 tons of supplies. Meanwhile, Alexander Mazurkin taking some measurements for Sprut, which again looks to study how the body reacts to the and how it stays hydrated once in microgravity for long periods of time. He helped out Pavel Vinogradov with some of that cargo transfer and also doing some routine coolant system maintenance. Meanwhile, yesterday on Thursday, Chris Cassidy was setting up the combustion integrated rack for another run of the BASS experiment, or the burning and suppression of solids. He also spent quite a bit of time inside of the Quest airlock doing some routine maintenance on the station's extravehicular mobility units, or EMUs. They are the suits that these astronauts wear when they step outside of the station for spacewalks. He was dumping out some of the water stored in tanks, which help cool and run the suit, and refilling them once again. Meanwhile, on Thursday, Roman Romanenko doing some body size measurements is just part of ongoing medical tracking for these astronauts during their expedition space flights, and he spent pretty much all of his day preparing that Soyuz vehicle and pre-packing some of the items that'll be returning home, with him again leaving the station with Tom Marshburn and Chris Hadfield just under 2 weeks from now. Then on Thursday, Tom Marshburn, working with the Integrated Cardiovascular Study, he was doing some ultrasound scans. The Integrated Cardiovascular, a NASA study that looks to just focus on the heart muscle and how it changes during microgravity exposure. Typically, atrophy of the heart or weakening of the muscles of the heart can be found if not properly countered. Aside from that, Marshburn also had a chance to do a ham radio pass with students in Greensboro, North Carolina, answering questions and giving them a bit of cool insight into life on board the International Space Station. And all of that brings us to today, Friday, May 3rd. Right now on board station, Chris Hadfield earlier this morning, alongside of his departing crew members, did a check of their Kentvar garments. It's a corset-like garment worn similar to a pair of shorts that's very tightly laced, and they'll wear that during their descent in their Soyuz craft. It helps to keep blood from pooling in the legs upon the return to gravity. Aside from that, he's also continuing his work on that payload Ethernet hub gateway that was initialized a little bit earlier this week. So he looks to continue upgrading the network infrastructure for controlling many of the payloads on board station. Again, here's some video of Chris Hadfield doing that. He'll be doing that most of the afternoon today. Then moving on, Pavel Vinogradov is doing some onboard training for the crew healthcare system. He'll be doing a drill and be joined by Alexander Mazurkin in that. Aside from that task today, he'll be doing an audit of all of the TVIS, or the treadmill with vibration and isolation and stabilization elements. TVIS, one of the many exercise devices found on board the International Space Station, as each of these astronauts getting in about 2.5 hours of physical activity in order to combat many of the negative effects on the human body that the weightless environment brings, requiring some routine maintenance. So he'll be working with that TVIS today. Meanwhile, Alexander Mazurkin doing many of the same tasks alongside of Pavel Vinogradov. He'll also be getting in some crew medical officer proficiency training as he works with experts down here on the ground to walk through some basic tasks required of the crew medical officer. Meanwhile, Chris Cassidy gathering some hardware up for the Fluids Integrated Rack, fluid physics experiment rack, hosting a number of payloads and experiment tasks on board the International Space Station. He'll also be taking some time to do some troubleshooting of the light microscopy module. The microscope in there showing a few issues, so he'll be working down here, or working with teams down here on the ground as they look to work through that. And you can see some video of Chris Cassidy right now as he is working through that task. And he'll be doing that again for much of his afternoon today. Meanwhile, Roman Romanenko continuing to prepare that Soyuz vehicle for its departure from the International Space Station. And he'll also be working on the Russian Electron system, which generates much of the oxygen for the Russian segment. And for these astronauts breathing atmosphere, he'll be filling up one of the water containers, which help to maintain it. And then our final crew member, Tom Marshburn, today, back at working on that integrated cardiovascular study. He'll be attaching a number of heart monitors and wearing them for about 24 hours. Again, integrated cardiovascular looking to track any of the atrophy of the heart muscle which can occur in these astronauts during their long time exposure to microgravity. He'll also be working with one of the express racks doing a controlling laptop software load, updating that in order to control what many of the payloads found inside of nanoracks.